Please join me now in offering a very warm welcome to John King.
Thank you so much, Frida, for the introduction. Thank you to Northwest High School for hosting us, and of course, thank you to the Montgomery County NAACP for having us all here this evening. Like probably everyone in this room, I have for my entire life admired the work of the NAACP, the fearless leadership of the NAACP in fighting for civil rights and a more just society. So it's truly an honor to be a part of tonight's conversation. I'm also excited to be a part of tonight's conversation as a parent of a 11th grader who's doing homework as we speak, I hope, and an 8th grader who I know is working on a project with friends as we speak. So I'm very proud to be a MCPS parent. I am also the husband, this may be my most important title, the husband of a NAACP Parent Council rep who is here. Melissa, my wife, is somewhere. There she is. She's going to be mortified, but I'm also excited to be in this conversation as an educator, having been a high school teacher and a middle school principal. But most importantly, I'm excited to be in this conversation with all of you because I share your conviction about the transformative power of education. And I share that conviction because of the difference that schools made in my own life. I always share with folks that I am only standing here today, only alive today, because of the difference that public school teachers made in my life. I grew up in Brooklyn. I went to New York City public schools. Both of my parents were New York City public school educators their whole careers. And they both were deeply committed to education. I grew up hearing about their students and their experiences in schools every day. But both my parents passed away when I was a kid. My mom when I was 8, my dad when I was 12. And in the period after my mom passed, she passed when I was in 4th grade. So in the period after she passed away, it was just my dad and me, and my dad was very sick with undiagnosed Alzheimer's. So home was this place where I didn't know what my father would be like from one night to the next. Some nights he would talk to me, some nights he wouldn't, some nights he'd be angry, some nights he'd be sad. Home was hard, home was lonely, home was often a scary place. But the thing that saved me was that every day I went to schools, New York City public schools, that were safe and nurturing and supportive and engaging. I had a teacher in 4th, 5th, 6th grade. He looped with us, which is very unusual in New York City public school at the time, Mr. Osterweil. In Mr. Osterweil's class, I could be a kid when I couldn't be a kid at home. In his class, we read the New York Times every day, 4th, 5th, 6th grade. We did productions of Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare in elementary school. We did a production of Alice in Wonderland. I was the rose in Alice in Wonderland with big red felt petals sticking out of my head. In Mr. Osterweil's class, he was the kind of teacher when you finished a book, he was there with the next. That was a little more challenging. When you finished a math problem, he was there with another to push you to keep learning. And he showed us this whole world of possibility outside of Canarsie, Brooklyn. I am quite certain that if I had not had Mr. Osterweil as my teacher in 4th, 5th, 6th grade, I wouldn't be standing here today. And one of the great honors of my life was to have Mr. Osterweil at my swearing in as secretary, so that I could in some small way thank him for the difference that he made in my life. But that is true in every community around the country. There are kids, adults in the school may not know what they are going through, but school may be the one place that for them is safe and nurturing and supportive. Those are the stakes of this conversation. And so I was very blessed to have those teachers in public schools who made that difference in my life. And so I think about this conversation tonight as about ensuring that that is available for every child in every school in Montgomery County and throughout the state of Maryland, regardless of race, regardless of zip code, regardless of how much money their family makes, regardless of their immigration status, regardless of the language they speak at home. That is our collective moral obligation, to ensure that every child has access to an excellent education. And the sad reality is we're not there yet. And the power of having the Black and Brown Coalition come together with 1,000 folks to be in conversation about the change we need, the power of having this room together is that we are the ones who can change it. We are the ones who can ensure that we deliver on the promise of educational equality for all our students. We know we're not there yet because the data show us that we're not there yet. We're not there yet. We're not delivering on equity and justice when we see that Black and Latino students from low-income families in the 7th grade are in twice as many classes with novice new teachers as their peers. We know we're not there yet when we know that our students walk through the door of a school that is integrated, but then walk down a segregated hallway, where they see on that segregated hallway that in some classrooms, the honors classes and AP classes have kids who look different from the other classes in the school. We know we're not there yet when we know that in Montgomery County and in the state, we still struggle with issues of implicit bias. We know that discipline disparities exist for Black and Latino students. We know that those disparities begin all over the country as early as pre-K. Consider that African American students are 18% of the kids in pre-K in the United States. They are 48% of the kids who are suspended more than one day from pre-K. 4-year-olds who are told school is not for you. Right? We would never do that for math. We would never say, oh, you struggled on a math quiz, no more math for you. But we do say that about the social environment. We say to kids, you're struggling with the social environment, no more social environment for you. And that school-to-prison pipeline produces our system of mass incarceration. We know we can change that. This is the room of people that can change that. We also know we're not there yet when we show in the data analysis that the Education Trust has done for Montgomery County, we show that only 5% of Latino students, only 8% of African American students from low-income families take algebra in 7th grade compared to 39% of their peers. We're not there yet if we are not delivering opportunity equitably to all of our students, and the students know it. At the gathering, at the Black and Brown gathering that Identity and NAACP led on the organizing, they had students share their experiences. Folks heard from Luz Chavez from Gaithersburg, who talked about her experience migrating to this area. She talked about the worst and best parts of her experience in Montgomery County, and she named that she had to change schools at one point because she and her family felt like her math teacher was not willing to give her the support she needed to succeed. Now because of the good experiences she had in the county, she's actually at Trinity, Washington with a National Dream US scholarship. So she could talk very clearly about the ways that opportunity was made available, but also the opportunities that were missed. We heard from Giancarlo Vera, a graduate of Montgomery County Public Schools, a graduate of Montgomery College and the University of Maryland. And Giancarlo talked about his disappointment that counselors didn't talk with him about how his post-secondary education choice could help him get to the career he wants as a doctor. Right? Our students know when the opportunities are not equitable, and our task as the adults is to listen to them. That's why the Black-Brown Coalition came together to say there are concrete changes we need. One of those changes is to make sure that all students have access to effective and diverse teachers. It's important for all kids to see teachers who are African American and Latino in their schools. Sometimes people will say to me, oh, well, sure, that makes sense. That's important for students of color. But I would argue it's also important for white students to see Black and Latino leaders in classrooms and schools. All kids need to see this kind of diverse community of adults standing up for them. The Black and Brown Coalition also calls for the importance of ensuring that there are effective and diverse leaders in all of our schools. And we need diversity and strength in our teacher workforce, but also in who is leading in our schools. The Black and Brown Coalition also talks about the importance of all students having access to the opportunity to master rigorous coursework. And this is a place where Jack has led the move to universal screening for access to enrichment opportunities and magnet opportunities, the move to ensure that IB is available in more schools. Those are important steps. But to the extent that students of color and low-income students are underrepresented in our advanced coursework and in magnet opportunities, we have more work to do collectively. And the coalition, the Black and Brown Coalition, importantly calls for a partnership between the district and advocates and the community. That there has to be a continuous conversation about how do we get closer to the promise of educational justice for all of our students. So I want to celebrate the work of the Black and Brown Coalition. I want to celebrate the leadership of NAACP and identity in that work. And I want to celebrate the openness of the school board, of the superintendent, and of Jack's leadership team to the feedback from the community. Can we give them all a round of applause? Now, one of our challenges as we do this work to advance a vision for educational justice is that as a country and as a state, we are not yet investing enough in our public schools. We treat public education like an expense when what it really is an investment in our long-term future. And so, that's right, you can applaud that. But we have an important opportunity. I want to take a moment to talk about the important opportunity we have in the state of Maryland. With a show of hands, how many people have heard about the work of the Kirwan Commission? Right? I'm glad to see so many hands because that commission creates an opportunity for the state to make a substantial additional investment not only in our schools, but in educational equity. That's an opportunity to make sure that all schools across the state have the resources they need to support our students. Now, as the Kirwan Commission work moves forward to a conversation in the legislature about how we will pay for these investments, there's going to be a robust debate about revenue. And again, what we're going to need to do as a community is to say, the revenue needs to be there. We're going to have to call on our elected officials, some in this very room who I know are going to lead on this issue. Right, we're going to have to call on them to be courageous around revenue. Now, there are some politicians in Annapolis, sounding a lot like politicians in D.C., who are calling the Kirwan Commission the Kirwan Tax Hike Commission. And what that's designed to do is to create fear about the need to invest in our children. Right? And folks are actually raising money to make sure that that message of fear is spread across the state. So part of our task is not just to be engaged citizens ourselves, but to organize our neighbors and communities to demand more investment, to demand that we invest in a quality early childhood education for every child in the state. We know that when we invest in quality early childhood education, the return is something like 8 to 1, 9 to 1 on every dollar invested. We got to make sure that low-income students and students of color have access to quality early childhood education. But this is a powerful investment that we can make together. The Kirwan Commission, if there's the revenue, will translate into increased compensation for our teachers. And we know that we need to pay our teachers more across the state of Maryland and across the country. We also know that we've got to make sure, that's right, we've also got to make sure that we do work to get the strongest teachers to the highest needs students. Again, we know from the analysis we've done in Montgomery County that too often students of color and low-income students disproportionately get first-year teachers rather than more experienced teachers. Disproportionately get across the state the teachers who've had the least experience studying the very subject that they're teaching. Right? So we have to make sure that as we make this investment, that we invest in getting quality teachers to all of our students. We know we need more investment in our English learners. We have a growing population across the state and country of English learners, but we haven't made the investment we need to in bilingual educators. We need to build a pipeline of bilingual educators, and that means we have to look not only to teacher prep institutions, but we have to look within our own schools. We have to look at paraprofessionals as a potential pool of bilingual educators. We have to look at folks who work in after-school and summer programs as a potential pool of diverse educators. We also, as we make these new investments, have to make sure that all students are getting access to college and career-ready opportunities. And that means AP, that means IB, that means magnet experiences, that means physics and chemistry and algebra 2, but it also means high-quality career and technical education that prepares students for real jobs that are available in the 21st century. Right? Too often, career and technical education means pre-engineering for some kids and preparation for jobs that used to exist for other kids. And we've got to make sure that it's high quality, but we have that opportunity if we make the investment. So we've got to be loud voices in Annapolis for the need to invest in our schools and loud voices for the need for that investment to advance education equity. So what's next? Well, we have important opportunities. We have an important conversation that will begin in Annapolis in January. We have an important conversation here in Montgomery County as Jack proposes a budget to the school board, an important opportunity to ensure and insist that that budget reflects the kind of equity values that the Black and Brown Coalition has been talking about, that we're talking about tonight. As Byron said, we've got to make sure that everybody votes. Mrs. Obama has an initiative called When We All Vote, which is about making sure that young people are registered, that parents are registered. We've all got to participate, and that doesn't mean just in presidential elections or congressional elections. That means in state legislative races, that means in school board races, county races. We've all got to be engaged citizens. And ultimately, what I believe our challenge is, the what next for all of us, is to ask what we are going to do, each of us, to advance the cause of social justice. You know, many of us who are too young to have participated in the civil rights movement ask ourselves what we would have done then. Would we have gone on the freedom rides? Would we have had the courage to sit in at lunch counters? Would we have been willing to suffer the hoses? Would we have been willing to go to prison for our convictions? Well, I would argue when you look across our country, when you see this moment and how we as a country are treating immigrants, when we see the violence by police against unarmed African Americans, when we see the inequity that is reflected in our economy and in our schools and in our health care. Think about that. African American women in New York City are 12 times as likely to die in childbirth as white women. And when you see those inequities, we don't have to ask what we would have done then. We have to ask each of us. We have to ask ourselves, what will we do now? What will each of us do? That's right. What will each of us do to stand up for civil rights? And we have to ask, how will we want our descendants to remember us? And so I'll close with this point. Some of you may have seen the Washington Post recently wrote a piece about my family's history in Montgomery County. My great-grandfather was enslaved in Gaithersburg, not 25 miles from my house in Silver Spring. The property where my great-grandfather was enslaved is still owned by the family that are direct line descendants of the family that owned my family. And the quarters, the enslaved people's quarters on the property where my great-grandfather lived, still standing on the property. And I've had the opportunity, my family, my wife and I, my daughters, we've had the opportunity to visit the property, to stand in that cabin where my great-grandfather and his siblings and his mother lived in slavery. And I've thought a lot about their perseverance. The fact that we are living our lives today here in Montgomery County, we have the opportunities we do. I had the opportunity to serve in the cabinet of the first African-American president because they lived for a future they could not see. Because they sacrificed for a future they could not see, couldn't even imagine. And I am deeply grateful, profoundly grateful to them for their willingness to live for that future they could not see. So when we think about the next generation, or 3 generations from now, or 4 generations from now, what will we want them to remember about us? What future will we have lived towards for their sake? That's our collective question. So this conversation tonight about educational equity, about educational justice, isn't just about this moment. It's not just about the next budget. It's not just about the next policy decision. It is about the kind of society, kind of world we want to live in and what we want to leave to our children and their grandchildren. That is our collective responsibility. Thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you so much for those words that were both inspiring and challenging to us. As you said, we've made some progress, and we've had a long history in Montgomery County of making progress in this area, and there's still a great deal of work to do, as we see in the data and the evidence and in our students' experience in our schools. As we think about our workforce, we are about 58% students of color, students in poverty, or students of color in poverty, when you look at all of them, 58, 59%. And yet our teaching force is about less than a quarter of individuals who represent those students. Our principals make up about 40%, and we take your challenge and your charge to us very seriously that students should see all people in their schools. So as we think about this and as we work to grow our own, and we're vigorously doing that, and in my budget, I'm going to propose a accelerated, extensive body of work, both to grow our own and to go out and recruit and do all of those things. What can we do, in your expert opinion, to make sure that we have culturally competent, responsive schools and classrooms and offices while we're building that workforce that we so desperately need?
Yeah. Well, it's encouraging that you're doing the work that you are to try to diversify the teacher workforce. I would say looking for opportunities to partner with our historically black colleges in the state, looking for opportunities to partner with our community colleges so that community college students see education as a place where they would want to go and ultimately transfer to four-year institutions so that they can get education degrees. It's another part of that pipeline strategy. We've got to make sure that we retain people. We just did a report at the Education Trust called "If You Listen, We Will Stay," which is aimed at addressing the challenge that we have nationally, that even when places do a better job on recruiting teachers of color, many times their attrition rate for teachers of color is higher than for white teachers. And when we interviewed teachers across the country, teachers of color, about their experience, what we heard was about what I've written about as an invisible tax on teachers of color. Teachers of color having the experience of being expected, for example, African-American male teachers being expected to be the disciplinarian at the school. Or Latina teachers talking about being expected to translate for families. And many times folks don't necessarily not want those additional responsibilities, but they often are not recognized, they're not compensated, they're not given the same leadership opportunities, and those additional things that they're taking on aren't recognized. We need to do more work to support communities amongst the teachers of color who are here, communities of support, to make it an attractive place. I love the work that the Bond Project is doing here in Montgomery County. So we need more of that kind of work to make sure that folks feel supported. We also have to work to make sure, one of the things we heard from teachers of color about why sometimes they don't want to stay is that they worry about the curriculum and whether or not the curriculum is reflective of all the experiences of their kids. And so we have to interrogate our curriculum. We have to ask, are kids being exposed to a diversity of authors? Are kids being exposed to important historical events and moments and actors that look different from them and that look like them? I often talk about it as we need to make sure the curriculum has windows and mirrors. Right? Opportunities to see beyond yourself, but also opportunities to see yourself reflected. And we have work to do on issues of implicit bias and having real conversation across lines of race and class and language about issues of equity and justice, of racism, of institutional bias. We got to have those conversations as a community. I know that's something that's important to you, and I think we got to make sure that's happening in every school. And again, it's as important in the school that has 80% kids of color as it is in the school that has 15% kids of color. This is the conversation about racism, about justice, needs to be a conversation that all kids have as part of their education.
Absolutely. Thank you. So, thank you. So as I think about your background, I'll tell you something here on stage that you may not know. The University of Maryland wrote to me or called me and said, would you write a letter in support of John King's professorship?
Oh, that's nice.
And so I have known your work for a long time. And when I was at the State Department, we looked at your work in New York, especially around your work around curriculum and instruction, which has been so strong for all students, especially our historically underserved students. And so as I think about that work in New York, as I think about the work you were doing at the Department of Education while I was at the Maryland State Department of Education, as I think about your varied expertise, what top 3 suggestions would you give me as I serve in this role?
Oh, that's a good opportunity. One is, I think, and this is something that the Black and Brown Coalition is very focused on, is that, and I think it's something you are committed to, and you and the board have to keep doing this, is continuously looking at disaggregated data to ask who's getting which opportunities, and whether that's who's getting access to the strongest teachers, who's getting access to advanced coursework, who's in the magnet programs, who's in the robotics club, right? Who's getting those opportunities, and similarly, who's getting suspended, who's getting in trouble, who's missing school, who's dropping out, who's struggling to pass their classes. And if we look at that data in a disaggregated way, we will identify where there are gaps, and we'll have to have hard conversations. And they may be hard district-wide conversations, they may be hard conversations within a school, or even within a classroom about who's getting opportunities and who isn't. So that's one. 2 is, I would say, this work on educator diversity. Has to be a top priority and has to be something that is thought about at every stage of the pipeline. So I love the Grow Your Own program. I would ask who's coming to student teach? What institutions are you partnering with to bring in student teachers? What kind of induction and mentoring support are new teachers of color to the district getting? How are we making sure that they feel supported early on? The work to ensure that young people in our high schools see teaching as a path for them, right? So that Grow Your Own has to be about paras and folks who are working in the schools, but it also has to be about young people in the next generation of teachers. And then a third piece I would say is around resources. And as you're thinking about the budget, how are we getting resources to the kids who need them most, which may mean reminding folks that we actually need to invest more in the students who have the greatest obstacles. And when we think about our growing population of English learners, kids who are recently arrived, kids who are speaking a language other than English at home, they have this tremendous asset that they could become bilingual, but that will take investment.
Right.
That will take investment both in their English language skills and in their development of their home language. And I worry as I look across the country that people are not necessarily making that investment the way they should. So really rigorously evaluating, are we allocating resources in a way that puts the highest level of investment towards the kids with the greatest needs?
Absolutely, absolutely what we're focused on trying to do every day here. And you make a great point. Language is an asset. Whatever language a student brings to school is an asset to that child, and it's our job to build on that asset. And I think every one of us in this room ought to be saying that every day, everywhere we go. And children bring tremendous potential. And for us to either help that potential bloom and grow or diminish and squelch that potential is what happens so often in the world around us.
Right.
And as we think about that and what we ought to do, one of the things that I've said since I've been here is MCPS cannot do it alone. And I think that's a shift in the way we think about school systems and school buildings and school districts, but we need to make that shift. So in your very extensive travels and work across the country. What are some of the most unique and profitable partnerships in terms of profit being student learning, student well-being, student sense of belonging, those things that you're seeing really work in partnerships with the communities?
Yeah, three quickly. One is when we can help kids have experiences after school, in the summer, or as part of the high school curriculum that give them a connection to what they might do after high school. I worry a lot when I see young people who get off track. It's because they don't have a vision into which they are living. But when you talk to kids who have an amazing internship experience, kids who have an amazing apprenticeship experience, ideally that's paid so that they have a little money in their pocket, right? What kids will describe is how that gives them a sense of purpose and an appreciation that what they're doing in school and the things that adults are asking them of them in school are actually going to help them with that next step. Dual enrollment can play a similar role when students have the opportunity to take college classes while in high school. And so we're seeing a lot of promise in those partnerships, not only in students graduating, but students graduating better prepared for what's next and making better college and career transitions. Second, I think a lot, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what you're doing on this, but I think a lot about mental health and socio-emotional development of our young people. I was just in Broward County, Florida last week, which is the community where Parkland is. And they're thinking a lot about how to support young people at Stoneman Douglas, the school where the tragedy happened, around the trauma they've experienced. But what it's raised for the entire county is that there are kids all over that county who've experienced trauma, and it's caused them to really reflect as a county about what are they doing to support kids who've experienced trauma, whether that's substance abuse in the home or violence in the community or domestic violence in the home. That kids have experienced these traumas, and oftentimes they are not addressed. So they are thinking a lot about how do you connect mental health services to schools so that kids and families get the support they need, and how do we also train teachers and principals to support kids' socio-emotional well-being. I know this is something that you're working on. And then the third that I'll mention is the kind of partnership that we hope will continue to evolve with the Black and Brown Coalition. That we believe at the Education Trust that districts will make more progress if they work in partnership with advocates as opposed to seeing advocates as hostile, as opponents, as critics.
Right.
And there are districts around the country where people are scared to talk with advocates, where the board members run from advocates, and I really appreciate the leadership of our school board and your leadership in saying, no, we're going to see advocates as partners.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much, John.